Welcome back to this third video on Prowler for AWS Security series. In this video, we are going to understand Prowler checks. We are going to cover Prowler checks, how to execute certain checks, look at the supported compliance frameworks, and we'll try to visualize like what's a check, what is a category, and what's compliance framework. And finally, look at different Prowler output formats. Like we saw in the previous video, Prowler comes with 300 plus checks and it checks across 60 plus AWS services, and the default Prowler scan goes ahead and scans all the regions and it executes all the 300 checks across all the services. You can think of Prowler checks as the minimal component when it comes to scanning. Each check would be associated with a single AWS service, and then it would be checking a particular criteria for that particular service. For example, let's say we are talking about S3. There could be one check that says there should be account level block access permission enabled. There could be another check saying that S3 should not have ACLs enabled. So in a nutshell, one AWS service can have many Prowler checks. Not every check is the same. Like there could be a specific category of checks for each service. For example, let's say encryption. Encryption is something that you need to enable for almost all resources. That's a best practice. So there could be encryption related checks for each service. There could be internet exposure checks for each service. What Prowler does is it creates a logical wrapper on top of checks and it creates something called categories. You can list down all the categories. It looks something like this. You have encryption, you have forensics, internet exposed, logging, trust boundaries, secrets. By default, all these categories, all the checks under these categories will be executed except the threat detection part. We'll be talking about threat detection in a future video in this series. If you want to list down all the checks or if you want to list down all the categories, you can just use these commands. Let me quickly check this out. Prowler AWS list checks. So it has given a lot of checks. Like, let's take the example of S3 again. It has multiple checks. One says there should be an account level public access block. There's another check that says S3 bucket KMS encryption. There's S3 bucket public access. So you can see that there are multiple checks just for a single AWS service. Let's try to list the categories. So there are 7 categories right now. Prowler is super flexible. That is what I think makes Prowler a great tool. Now let's say you have a requirement to execute only a few checks to start with, or maybe execute certain category of checks. Prowler allows that. Or even if you want to go ahead and execute checks only for a particular AWS service, Prowler also has options to do that. And these are the commands that are usually used. So if you want to, let's say, go ahead and execute individual Prowler checks, you can just use this. When it comes to categories like internet exposed or logging or encryption, just use this command. And for services, it's -- services and you mention the service name. Let's just do a single demo now. Let's say, let's list the checks. Let's take 2 things. Let's say S3 bucket level public access block. I mentioned the profile, which is Prowler demo. And then checks along with, let's say, S3 bucket KMS encryption. So I'm going to execute only these 2 checks. You can see that Prowler is executing just 2 checks which fall under the S3 service, and it finished quite quickly. And there are 2 other interesting options. One is excluded check and excluded service. This is the negated version. Let's say you want to execute all the checks excluding one, or you want to execute all the checks for all the services excluding a single AWS service, then you can use these options. Now let's move on to compliance frameworks. Prowler contains multiple checks based on the requirements from multiple compliance frameworks and best practice frameworks. Just like we listed the checks, listed the categories sometime back, you can also list the compliance frameworks that's available with Prowler. Just say Prowler AWS -- list compliance, and you will see that there are at the time of recording this video, there are around 28 available compliance frameworks. So now I've been talking about quite a few Prowler jargon. One is checks, next one is categories, and the third one is compliance. Right, let's try to visualize it. So check is a single check, that's it. It's associated with an AWS service. It looks for a misconfiguration or a best practice in that particular service. That's it. Now there is categories. Categories are a bunch of related checks that looks for a specific thing across services. For example, encryption. Encryption is something that's present across all AWS services. So these checks look just at the encryption part of it. So that's a category. Talking about compliance, that is also like category, but the focus of compliance framework checks is it's a group of checks that is looking for the requirements mentioned in a particular compliance framework. So that's about a check, a category, and compliance framework. And let's go back to the output that we got in the previous demo. By default, when we execute any Prowler scan, it creates reports. So in my case, it has created, I'm already in Prowler demo directory. It has created a folder called output and then it saves it. For every scan that you execute, it creates 3 file types by default. One is CSV file, next is HTML, and the other one is OCSF JSON file. And by default, if you have not mentioned any compliance frameworks, it also creates a directory called compliance and saves all the output to that directory. So let's say output and compliance. You can see that naming convention is very similar. It's account and the timestamp along with what's the compliance framework name. This is the default nature. Let's say you specifically mention a compliance framework, then it will not execute for all the compliance framework. It will just execute for that particular compliance framework and save that file in this directory. And Prowler is also capable of generating another type of file, JSON AWS security finding format. This file is generated when you integrate Prowler with Security Hub. By default, just the HTML, JSON OCSF, and CSV is created. And Prowler also gives you customization options. You can just create an output file based on the finding status, or you could just customize the output file name. And instead of using output direct, you can create a custom directory name using this output directory option. Pro tip before we end this video, you can actually save all the output reports in an S3 bucket if the IAM user that you're using has access to push objects to S3 bucket. So instead of you executing, storing the output files on your local system, you can use this output bucket option to go ahead and store your output in a remote S3 bucket. So the execution happens on your laptop, but the output will be stored in a remote S3 bucket. That's it in this video. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can go ahead and customize Prowler checks. So if you have any doubts in this video, just feel free to comment it down. See you in the next one.